Welcome to this overview on the application process for requesting an accommodation based on the Americans with Disabilities Act at Stockton University. This program is a collaboration of the ADA 504 Steering Committee, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Office of Human Resources. In this basic education session, you will first learn about reasonable accommodations, what they are, who is an individual with a disability, and what are essential job functions. Second, you will learn how employees at Stockton can request an accommodation and what the process entails. This tutorial will take approximately 15 minutes to complete. There are two primary laws that prohibit employment discrimination because of disability: the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination and the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. The LAD and ADA prohibit discrimination based on disability and certain medical conditions in employment practices, including recruitment, hiring, training, job assignments, compensation, benefits, promotions, leave, and other related employment practices. Stockton University's policy prohibiting discrimination in the workplace also prohibits discrimination in the workplace. For more information on the university's policy, employees are encouraged to contact Stockton's Office of Equal Opportunity and Institutional Compliance. The ADA guides and informs the reasonable accommodation process at Stockton.
Let's begin by defining disability. For purposes of employment, the ADA defines disability as, quote, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, such as walking, talking, seeing, hearing, performing manual tasks, or of a major bodily function, such as brain, musculoskeletal, respiratory, circulatory, or endocrine function. A record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. A temporary impairment, such as a broken arm or leg, or recovery from surgery, may also be considered a disability. Any one of these may require a reasonable accommodation. An accommodation is a modification or adjustment that enables a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy an equal employment opportunity. An equal employment opportunity means an opportunity to attain the same level of performance or to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment as are available to an average similarly situated employee without a disability. The ADA requires reasonable accommodation in two aspects of employment. One, to ensure equal opportunity in the application process, and two, to enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job. There are two additional terms that need to be defined as we review reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations are for qualified persons with disabilities. A qualified person is someone that meets the requisite qualifications and can perform the essential functions of the job position sought or held, with or without reasonable accommodation. Essential functions are defined as core expectations and responsibilities of the job. In other words, the reason the job exists. At Stockton, a job description contains only essential functions, and therefore employees who are hired into a position must be qualified to perform all the functions listed in the description. A person with a disability who has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job may need an accommodation in order to perform some or all of the tasks. State and federal laws require an employer to provide a reasonable accommodation when requested by a qualified person with a disability, unless it would create an undue hardship for the employer. An employer does not have to provide the accommodation the employee or job applicant specifically requests, as long as it provides an effective, reasonable accommodation. If more than one accommodation effectively meets the disability-related needs, the employer may choose which one to provide.
When a qualified person with a disability is having or will have a difficulty in completing one or more essential functions of the job, they can request a reasonable accommodation from the employer. Reasonable accommodations are specific based on an individual's disability and job description and determined on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at an example. The background image of this slide shows a mobility impaired employee who uses a wheelchair. If the essential function of the employee's job is to move the packages on the shelves, a reasonable accommodation for this person might involve storing the packages at a height no higher than where the employee can reach them. There are likely more ways to accommodate this employee, which would be determined through the interactive process that will be discussed shortly. The ADA provides examples of reasonable accommodations. However, what is reasonable is a fact-specific determination based on the essential functions of the job and the specific details regarding the employee's disability. Some common examples of reasonable accommodations include, but may not be limited to, making existing facilities readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities, to job restructuring, modified work schedules, reassignment to a vacant position, acquisition or modification of equipment or devices, or provision of qualified readers or interpreters.
There are also times when a requested accommodation is considered not reasonable because it creates an undue hardship on the employer's business operations or budgetary limits. If we return to the early example of the employee who uses a wheelchair and needs to reach and or move the packages on the shelves that they cannot reach, we already know that a job modification for this employee might be not to store packages at a height where the employee cannot reach them. What would not be considered a reasonable accommodation in this example is eliminating the task of working with the packages altogether. Completely eliminating an essential function of a job or reassigning the function to another employee is not considered a reasonable accommodation because working with the packages has been identified as an essential function of the job. Another example of what would not be considered a reasonable accommodation would be a custodian whose essential functions of the job take place on campus. Although moving the custodian's assignment to another building may be a reasonable accommodation based on the documented disability, working off campus is not reasonable. A third example is reassignment. Employers can reassign employees as an accommodation into an appropriate existing vacant position for which the person is qualified to fill. Employers are not, however, required to create a new position as an accommodation. In a case where a requested accommodation poses an undue hardship, appropriate and effective alternative accommodations will be explored through the interactive process. Let's review that process now. In the ADA, the process an employer and employee would go through to reach a reasonable and effective accommodation is called the interactive process. The interactive process is a collaborative effort between the employee and the employer, and possibly the employee's supervisor and healthcare provider, to discuss the need for a reasonable accommodation as well as identify effective accommodation solutions. As mentioned in an earlier slide, what is reasonable is specific and determined on a case-by-case basis. Webster's dictionary defines effective as, quote, adequate to accomplish a purpose or producing the intended or expected result, end quote. This slide shows the general steps of the interactive process. It is important to note that the interactive process is always initiated when an employee or applicant discloses their disability to the employer and states that it is impacting their work or ability to participate in the interview process. Once the disability is disclosed, the employer initiates an interactive dialogue with the employee or applicant with the goal of moving through all the steps above. The remainder of this tutorial will focus on the specific steps for requesting an accommodation at Stockton University.
The employee with a disability initiates the accommodation request process by contacting the Office of Human Resources. The employee should contact Bart Musitano, the Pensions and Benefits Manager, who will coordinate the accommodation request through the interactive process. The employee will be given 2 forms that need to be completed, which provide more information about the employee's disability. The Reasonable Accommodation Request form is completed by the employee, and the Medical Provider Authorization Release form is completed by the employee's medical provider. The medical provider form asks for more information about the medical condition, as well as suggested accommodations from the medical provider. If the Office of Human Resources needs additional information from the medical provider, the employee must provide permission for the Pensions and Benefits Manager to contact the medical provider. For example, if the medical provider on their form does not provide information about the medical condition or the duration of the accommodation request, the Pensions and Benefits Manager would need to contact the medical provider to seek this information.
Once an accommodation request has been received, the Pensions and Benefits Manager will initiate the interactive process with the employee to discuss the need for a reasonable accommodation and identify effective accommodation solutions. This interactive process is an exchange of information to help determine a reasonable and effective accommodation. The Pensions and Benefits Manager will then inform supervisors about necessary restrictions on the work duties of the employee. Medical information is confidential and is not shared with the employee's supervisor beyond the extent that it is needed to describe any necessary restrictions to the employee's work duties and to assist with identifying appropriate accommodation options. Sometimes the employee and the supervisor will take different positions on an accommodation. The Pensions and Benefits Manager facilitates the conversation between the employee and the supervisor to assist with determining the most efficient and effective job modification that will enable the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. The Pensions and Benefits Manager may also consult with other areas that may assist in providing the accommodation, i.e. ITS, or facilities to identify all possible accommodation options and implementation. Once the employee and university identify a reasonable accommodation, the Pensions and Benefits Manager will memorialize the outcome of the interactive process in writing, which is then provided to the employee and the supervisor. Depending on the disability, the letter may also inform the employee that the accommodation will be reviewed within a certain period of time and that the employee may need to provide updated medical information if the accommodation needs to be extended. All employees have an obligation to immediately inform the Pensions and Benefits Manager of any changes in their medical condition.
This concludes the brief education on the reasonable accommodation process for employees at Stockton University. In summary, we covered the learning objectives of defining reasonable accommodations, clarifying who qualifies for a reasonable accommodation, and describing essential job functions related to accommodations. We also reviewed the steps of the interactive process and the specifics for requesting an accommodation at Stockton. If you have questions about the employee accommodation process, please contact Bart Musitano, Pensions and Benefits Manager. For broader questions about the ADA or disability support at Stockton University, please contact Dr. Valerie Hayes, Chief Officer for Diversity and Inclusion and ADA 504 Coordinator.